The static crackled once, then died. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison pressed his comm unit harder against his ear, willing the silence to break. Nothing. Just the oppressive weight of Afghan mountains pressing down on his six-man SEAL team, trapped in a valley that had become their tomb. "Comms are black, sir." Petty Officer Rodriguez didn't need to say it. They all knew. The Taliban had them surrounded, and their lifeline to the world had been severed 3 hours ago when the IED took out their radio operator. Now they crouched behind a cluster of boulders, watching muzzle flashes dance across the ridgeline like deadly fireflies. Morrison checked his watch. 13:47 hours. Their extraction window had opened 17 minutes ago, but without comms the birds wouldn't risk coming in blind. Standard protocol. Smart protocol. Deadly protocol. The mystery wasn't why they'd lost contact. The mystery was what that sound meant. The low rumble growing louder from the south, too heavy to be a helicopter, too slow to be a fighter. Morrison had heard that sound before in Iraq, in Somalia. A C-130 Hercules flying low enough to taste dirt. But C-130s didn't do combat rescues. They were cargo birds, supply drops, personnel transport. They sure as hell didn't dive into hot zones where every ridge crawled with hostiles wielding RPGs. Yet there it was, emerging from behind the mountain like some ancient metal deity, its 4 turboprops chopping the thin air with mechanical precision. The aircraft banked hard left, exposing its gray-green belly to the valley. Suicide. Morrison watched through his scope as tracer rounds reached up like angry fingers, missing the lumbering giant by mere feet. The pilot either had balls of titanium or a death wish. Then he saw it. The cargo door was sliding open, but instead of supplies or paratroopers, something else emerged. A light, Morse code, 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS, but backwards. They were sending, not receiving. Morrison's blood went cold. Someone up there was trying to communicate, using the oldest code in the book. But who? And how did they know exactly where to find 6 dead men walking in a valley the size of Manhattan? The C-130 banked again, this time revealing a detail that made Morrison's heart skip. Painted on the starboard engine nacelle, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look, a small black star. Not standard military markings. Not standard anything. The rumble faded as the aircraft climbed, but the mystery deepened. Someone knew they were here. Someone cared enough to risk a multi-million-dollar aircraft and crew. Someone with access to classified intel and the authority to deviate from protocol. The question that kept gnawing at Morrison as he watched his men's ammunition dwindle wasn't who was flying that bird. It was why they'd bothered to come at all. Major Catalina, Raven, Vasquez felt the C-130's massive frame shudder as another burst of anti-aircraft fire streaked past the cockpit. Her co-pilot, Captain Peters, gripped his yoke with white knuckles, but Raven's hands remained steady on the controls. 23 years of flying everything from crop dusters to strategic bombers had taught her that panic was just fear with poor time management. "Jesus Christ, Raven, they're lighting us up down there," Peters shouted over the roar of the engines. The loadmaster's voice crackled through the intercom, confirming what they already knew. They'd found the SEALs, but extracting them would require a miracle wrapped in aviation fuel and desperation. Raven banked the aircraft into another tight turn, feeling the familiar pull of G-forces against her body. The C-130 wasn't built for aerobatics, but she'd learned long ago to make aircraft do things their designers never intended. Below them, 6 American warriors were counting down their final hours, and she'd be damned if she'd let them die on her watch. "Tower, this is Ghost Rider 77, requesting immediate close air support at grid reference Tango 479er Alpha." She kept her voice level, professional, even as tracers lit up the sky around them like a deadly light show. The response came back harsh and immediate. "Negative, Ghost Rider. You are not authorized for combat operations. Return to base immediately." Raven smiled grimly. Authorization was for people who played by rules written by men who'd never seen their brothers die in foreign dirt. She'd spent 3 tours in Iraq watching good soldiers come home in flag-draped boxes because someone in a comfortable office decided that following protocol was more important than following conscience. "Tower, I'm experiencing radio difficulties." "Say again." She reached over and switched off the long-range comm, ignoring Peter's horrified expression. Some conversations were better left unfinished. The truth was, she'd been monitoring SEAL team communications all morning, using her aircraft's sophisticated electronic warfare suite to stay informed of operations in her sector. When their comms went dark, she'd made a choice that would either earn her a medal or a court-martial. Probably both. Her crew thought she was crazy. Hell, maybe she was. But crazy had kept her alive through 2 decades of military service, and it was about to keep 6 SEALs alive too. She'd earned her call sign Raven not for her black hair or dark eyes, but for her habit of appearing when death circled closest. Ravens were scavengers, some said. She preferred to think of them as guardians of the fallen. The C-130 groaned as she pushed it through another aggressive maneuver, dropping altitude until she could see individual faces on the ridgeline. Taliban fighters were repositioning, trying to get better angles on her aircraft while maintaining their siege of the trapped Americans below. Time for the real magic to begin. Morrison watched the C-130 complete its 3rd pass, each run bringing it lower and more exposed to ground fire. Whoever was flying that bird had a serious death wish, but they also had serious skills. The aircraft moved through the valley like it weighed nothing, dancing between mountain peaks with a grace that defied physics. "Sir, what's the play?" Rodriguez had that look in his eyes, the same look Morrison had seen in Ramadi when they'd been pinned down for 18 hours. Not fear, exactly, but a recognition that conventional options had run out. Before Morrison could answer, the C-130's cargo door opened again. This time, something dropped out. Not supplies, a single figure in a parachute falling too fast, opening too late. A halo jump in broad daylight in a hot zone with every hostile in the valley tracking their descent. The parachute opened with a crack that echoed off the mountains, and Morrison caught sight of the jumper through his scope. Small frame, efficient movements, landing with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't their first dance with gravity and bullets. The figure hit the ground running, shedding their chute and immediately taking cover behind a rocky outcrop about 200 meters from the SEAL position. Morrison keyed his short-range radio, hoping whoever had just dropped in was monitoring their frequency. "Unknown jumper, this is SEAL Team Actual. Identify yourself." The response came back in a voice that surprised him, calm female, with just a hint of accent he couldn't place. "SEAL Actual, this is Raven. I'm here to get you home." Raven. The name meant nothing to Morrison, but something in her tone suggested it should. His team's sniper, Johnson, was already tracking movement on the ridgeline where Taliban fighters were repositioning to engage the new threat. "Raven, be advised, you just jumped into a shitstorm. We're surrounded and low on ammunition." "Copy that. I've got eyes on your position and a plan to get you out, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say." Trust. In Morrison's experience, trust was earned in combat, measured in split-second decisions that kept teammates alive. This Raven had just parachuted into hell to help 6 strangers. That was either trust earned or trust insane. The C-130 was coming around for another pass, this time even lower. Morrison could see the aircraft's open cargo door, could make out figures moving around inside. Whatever plan Raven had in mind, it was about to unfold. "All units, this is Raven. Phase 1 begins in 30 seconds. When I give the word, suppress fire on the eastern ridge and prepare for immediate extraction." Morrison didn't know who Raven was, but he was about to find out if she was their guardian angel or their ticket to a very public military funeral. The first indication that Raven knew exactly what she was doing came when the eastern ridge suddenly erupted in smoke and confusion. Morrison had been expecting suppressive fire, maybe some creative use of the few grenades they had left. Instead, he watched through his scope as Taliban positions simply disappeared. What the hell was that? Peter's voice crackled through her earpiece as she sprinted between cover positions, her rifle tracking movement on the ridgeline. "Thermite charges," she replied, breathing steady despite the full combat load and thin mountain air. "Placed them during my descent. Amazing what you can accomplish when people expect you to fall straight down." The truth was more complex. Raven had been planning this operation from the moment she'd intercepted the SEAL's initial distress call. While her C-130 made its reconnaissance passes, she'd been calculating wind patterns, enemy positions, and insertion points. The Halo jump hadn't been desperate improvisation. It had been surgical precision wrapped in apparent madness. Her real name was Major Catalina Vasquez, but she'd been Raven for so long that even her military records sometimes forgot. The call sign had started as mockery in flight school, the quiet Mexican girl who appeared whenever someone crashed, picking through wreckage for lessons in survivors. Her instructors thought she was morbid. They didn't understand that death was the best teacher she'd ever had. "SEAL Actual, this is Raven. I need covering fire on the northwest approach. My bird's coming in for a combat landing, and we need that LZ clear." Morrison's team was already moving, their professionalism overriding any questions about who this woman was or how she'd materialized in their valley of death. They laid down disciplined fire while Raven bounded forward, moving with the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of combat experience. The C-130 was descending now, approaching the valley floor at an angle that made Peters question everything he'd learned about aircraft limitations. The landing zone was barely long enough for a basketball court, surrounded by rocks that would turn any mistake into twisted metal and body bags. "Raven, be advised that LZ is way too short for a Hercules," Morrison called out. "Copy, we're not landing conventionally." What happened next would be discussed in military aviation circles for decades. The C-130 didn't land. It performed something between a controlled crash and an act of pure will. Raven brought the massive aircraft in at a steep angle, touching down hard and immediately deploying every braking system the aircraft possessed. The reverse thrust from 4 turboprops turned the mountain air into a hurricane of dust and debris. The aircraft slid to a stop less than 50 feet from the rocky outcrop where Morrison's team was positioned. The cargo door was already open, revealing a crew that moved with the same precise efficiency as their pilot. "Move, move, move." Raven's voice cut through the chaos as Taliban fighters, recovering from their shock, began concentrating fire on the stationary aircraft. Morrison didn't need to be told twice. His team bounded toward the C-130 in practiced fire and movement, covering each other while Raven provided overwatch from her position. But as they reached the aircraft, Morrison caught sight of something that made him pause. Raven's flight suit bore no standard unit patches, no rank insignia he recognized. Just that small black star he'd seen on the aircraft, and a name tape that read simply, "Ghost." The mystery of who Raven was had just deepened, but the mystery of whether she could get them out was about to be answered. The C-130's engines were screaming at full throttle before the last SEAL had cleared the cargo door. Raven was already in motion, sprinting toward the cockpit while her loadmaster secured the ramp. She could feel the aircraft straining against its brakes, every rivet and bolt protesting the abuse she was about to inflict on the airframe. "Everyone secure," she called back to the cargo bay. "All souls aboard," came the reply. Raven released the brakes and pushed the throttles to their stops. The C-130 lurched forward, accelerating down a runway that existed only in her imagination. She had maybe 800 feet of relatively flat ground before the terrain started climbing toward a rock wall that would turn them into a fireball visible from orbit. Through the cockpit windows, she could see muzzle flashes from the ridgeline as Taliban fighters poured fire into their escape route. Tracer rounds streaked past like angry hornets, some close enough to hear their passage over the engine noise. "Raven, we're taking hits in the cargo bay." The loadmaster's voice was tight with controlled panic. She didn't respond, couldn't respond. Every fiber of her being was focused on coaxing impossible performance from an aircraft never designed for combat takeoffs. The C-130 was gathering speed, but not fast enough. The rock wall was growing larger, filling her windscreen like a judgment. At the last possible second, she hauled back on the yoke, pulling the aircraft into a climb so steep that several of her passengers probably thought they were about to die. The C-130 clawed its way skyward, turboprops biting into thin air, engines operating beyond their design limits. They cleared the ridge by less than 50 feet. In the cargo bay, Morrison was pressed against the webbing, watching Major Catalina Vasquez through the open cockpit door. From his position, he could see her hands on the controls, steady, confident, completely at odds with the insanity of what she'd just accomplished. Her co-pilot was slumped in his seat, either unconscious or praying. Maybe both. "Who the hell is she?" Rodriguez asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Morrison had been wondering the same thing. In 20 years of special operations, he'd worked with every elite unit the military had to offer, but he'd never encountered anyone like Raven. The precision of her operation, the resources at her disposal, the willingness to risk everything for 6 strangers, it spoke to something beyond normal military channels. The C-130 leveled off at altitude, and Raven finally appeared in the cargo bay. Up close, Morrison could see she was older than he'd first thought, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered features that came from years of squinting into foreign skis. Her flight suit was customized, equipped with gear he didn't recognize. Professional modifications that suggested she'd been doing this kind of work for a very long time. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen." Her voice was steady, but Morrison caught the slight tremor that spoke of adrenaline slowly bleeding away. Even guardian angels felt fear. "Ma'am, I need to ask." "You need to ask who I am, what unit I'm with, and why I just risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft to pull your asses out of a valley in Afghanistan." She smiled, and for the first time Morrison saw something human in her eyes. Fair questions, wrong time. She moved to a secure communication console Morrison hadn't noticed before, her fingers dancing over controls with practiced efficiency. "Right now, I need to convince some very angry people that saving your lives was worth disobeying a direct order." Through the aircraft's windows, Morrison could see they were heading south, toward Bagram probably, but he couldn't be sure. What he was sure of was that Major Catalina, Raven, Vasquez had just pulled off one of the most audacious rescue operations he'd ever witnessed. And something told him the real story was just beginning. The debriefing room at Bagram Airfield felt like a courtroom, complete with judges, prosecutors, and one very isolated defendant. Raven sat at the far end of a metal table, still wearing her flight suit, facing a panel of officers whose collective rank could have funded a small war. Morrison and his team had been whisked away for medical evaluation and their own debriefing, leaving her to face the consequences of her unauthorized rescue mission alone. Colonel Bradley, the base commander, led the interrogation with the enthusiasm of a man who'd found a perfect excuse to make an example. "Major Vasquez, do you understand the severity of what you've done? Disobeying direct orders, risking military assets, conducting unauthorized combat operations." Raven listened to the litany of charges with the patience of someone who'd heard it all before. In her jacket pocket, she carried a letter, 23 years old, written by a young lieutenant who'd watched his men die because someone in a comfortable office had decided that following protocol was more important than following conscience. She'd carried that letter through 3 wars, a reminder of why she'd chosen this path. Sir, 6 American servicemen are alive because of my actions. I'll answer for the methods, but I won't apologize for the results. The room erupted in murmurs and angry whispers. Only one person remained silent, a woman in army dress uniform sitting at the back of the room. Morrison had noticed her when they'd brought him in to give testimony, but he couldn't place her rank or unit. She watched Raven with the intensity of someone who understood the deeper currents of this tribunal. Major, you seem to forget that you're not a special operations pilot. You fly cargo, supply runs. You don't have the authority or the training to conduct combat rescues. Colonel Bradley's voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering a killing blow. That's when Raven smiled, not the careful, professional expression she'd worn throughout the hearing, but something genuine and slightly dangerous. Sir, with respect, you might want to check my complete service record before making that assessment. The woman in the back of the room finally spoke. Perhaps I can clarify. She stood, revealing the eagle of a full colonel, but Morrison still couldn't identify her unit. Major Vasquez, would you please tell the panel about Operation Nightingale? The room went dead quiet. Morrison had heard whispers about Nightingale, a classified operation during the height of the Iraqi insurgency, something involving deep-cover rescue missions and pilots who didn't officially exist. Ghost operations for situations where normal channels had failed. Ma'am, Operation Nightingale is classified beyond the scope of this hearing. The classification was lifted an hour ago, specifically for these proceedings. The colonel moved to the front of the room, carrying a file that looked thick enough to stop bullets. Colonel Bradley, I think you'll find Major Vasquez's service record illuminating. As the file was passed around the panel, Morrison watched their expressions change. Confusion gave way to surprise, then to something approaching awe. Whatever was in that file, it was rewriting their understanding of who Raven really was. Major, the mystery colonel continued, would you please explain to the panel why you carry the call sign Raven? For the first time since Morrison had met her, Raven looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, the call sign was assigned during my service with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Ravens appear when death circles closest. The designation indicated my role in high-risk recovery operations. Morrison felt the pieces clicking into place. The 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, the most elite helicopter and fixed-wing pilots in the military, specialists in operations that officially never happened. The mystery colonel wasn't finished, and your current assignment? Classified, ma'am. Not anymore. Major Vasquez currently serves as the primary pilot for Joint Special Operations Command's most sensitive recovery missions. Her authorization comes directly from the Secretary of Defense for operations deemed critical to national security. The room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of aircraft operations. Colonel Bradley looked like a man who just realized he'd been trying to court-martial a ghost. Gentlemen, the mystery colonel addressed the panel, Major Vasquez didn't disobey orders yesterday. She followed higher orders that you weren't cleared to know about. Morrison finally understood who Raven really was, and why 6 SEALs were alive. The mystery colonel's name was Elizabeth Kane, and she carried credentials that made grown generals nervous. Morrison learned this during his own debriefing, conducted in a secure facility that definitely wasn't part of standard Bagram operations. The room had no windows, no identifying marks, and the kind of electronic countermeasures that suggested very serious people took very serious precautions here. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that will follow you for the rest of your career. Colonel Kane settled into her chair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing information. Major Vasquez works for a unit that officially doesn't exist, conducting operations that officially never happen. Morrison had suspected as much. The precision of the rescue, the specialized equipment, the way higher authorities had materialized to protect her, it all pointed to something beyond normal military channels. Black Ops. Deeper than black, she's part of a program called Lazarus Protocol, resurrection of personnel from situations where conventional rescue has failed or been deemed impossible. Kane opened a file that was mostly redacted text and satellite photos. For the past 8 years, she's been our primary asset for what we call terminal extractions. The phrase sent a chill down Morrison's spine. Terminal extractions. Operations where the choice was between breaking every rule in the book and watching American servicemen die in foreign dirt. He thought about the Taliban fighters on that ridgeline, the impossible angles of that valley, the suicide mission that Raven had made look routine. How many, he asked. Classified, but enough that certain people in very high places consider her worth protecting. Kane leaned forward, her expression growing serious. What happened yesterday wasn't random, Commander. We've been tracking your mission since insertion. When your communications went dark, Lazarus Protocol was activated automatically. Morrison felt pieces falling into place. The sophisticated monitoring equipment on Raven's C-130, her knowledge of their exact position, the thermite charges she'd somehow placed during her descent. All of it suggested preparation and intelligence gathering that went far beyond improvised rescue. She was watching us the whole time. She was protecting you the whole time. There's a difference. Kane closed the file and leaned back. What you witnessed yesterday represents years of training, planning, and technological development focused on one goal: making sure that American warriors never have to die alone in places their government can't officially acknowledge. The room fell quiet except for the hum of electronic equipment. Morrison thought about his team, about the moment they'd accepted that they might not make it home. Then he thought about the sound of turboprops and a voice on the radio saying, "I'm here to get you home." Why are you telling me this? Because Major Vasquez requested it. She said you deserved to understand why she was willing to risk everything. Kane stood, signaling the end of the briefing. She also wanted you to know that yesterday wasn't about heroics or glory. It was about a promise she made a long time ago. What promise? Kane paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. That no one who wears the same flag would ever die forgotten. Morrison sat alone in the secure room, processing what he'd learned. Somewhere in this base, Major Catalina Raven Vasquez was probably filing reports and preparing for her next impossible mission. But he would always remember her as the pilot who appeared when death circled closest, who kept promises that others couldn't make. The guardian angel who refused to let good soldiers become statistics. 3 months later, Morrison was back home in Virginia Beach, trying to readjust to a world where morning coffee wasn't followed by mission briefings, and the sound of helicopters didn't automatically make him check his weapon. The transition was never easy, but this time felt different. Every time he saw a C-130 on approach to Oceana Naval Air Station, he thought about thermite charges and impossible takeoffs, and a pilot who'd risked everything for 6 strangers. His wife noticed the change. "You're different since Afghanistan," she said one evening as they watched the sunset from their back porch. "Quieter, more, I don't know, grateful." Morrison nodded, sipping beer and watching civilian aircraft trace lazy patterns across the Virginia sky. How could he explain that he'd witnessed something that officially never happened, performed by someone who officially didn't exist? That he owed his life to a ghost who flew cargo planes into combat zones and somehow made physics optional? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Unknown number, but something about it felt familiar. "Commander Morrison, this is Major Vasquez." He straightened, suddenly alert. "Raven, how did you?" "I have my ways. Listen, I'm calling because I have something that belongs to you." Her voice carried the same calm confidence he remembered from that day in the valley. "Your team dropped some gear during the extraction. Personal items." Morrison frowned. They'd done a thorough inventory after the mission. Everything had been accounted for. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what." Rodriguez left a letter in his vest pocket. Johnson dropped a photo. Martinez had a St. Christopher medal that came loose during the movement to the aircraft. She paused, and Morrison could hear the sound of turboprops in the background. "These things matter, Commander. They're pieces of who we are when everything else gets stripped away." It hit him then. She'd gone back. Somehow, someway, Major Catalina Vasquez had returned to that valley in Afghanistan to collect personal items that 6 SEALs had lost during the most chaotic rescue mission any of them had ever experienced. Items that had seemed trivial in the moment but carried the weight of identity, of connection, of home. "Raven, you didn't have to." "Actually, I did. It's part of the promise." The background noise was getting louder now. She was preparing for another mission, another impossible rescue, another group of Americans who needed a guardian angel. "I'll have someone deliver the items to your team. Tell them. Tell them that ravens don't forget." The line went dead, leaving Morrison alone with the sunset and the realization that some people carried the weight of the world not because they had to, but because they chose to. Because someone had to be willing to break the rules when following them meant good soldiers died alone. He thought about Rodriguez's letter, probably from his daughter, maybe his wife. About Johnson's photo, which was likely his family or his high school sweetheart. About Martinez's St. Christopher medal, a piece of faith carried into the darkest places on earth. Raven had remembered them all, had cared enough to risk returning to a place where Taliban fighters might still be waiting, where every rock could hide an enemy, where one mistake meant death. That night, Morrison called his team to let them know their personal items were coming home, but he didn't tell them about the pilot who'd made it possible. Some guardian angels preferred to remain in the shadows. The package arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by courier to Morrison's home. No return address, no official markings, just a plain box that contained pieces of 6 men's lives and a note written in careful handwriting. "These belong to warriors. They should be returned to warriors. Stay safe. R." Inside Rodriguez's letter was exactly what Morrison had expected. A crayon drawing from his 5-year-old daughter, complete with stick figures, and a house that defied architectural physics. Johnson's photo showed a young woman in a wedding dress, smiling at a camera held by someone who loved her very much. Martinez's St. Christopher medal was worn smooth by years of faithful hands, a testament to faith carried through the darkest valleys. But there was something else in the box, something Morrison hadn't expected. A small piece of metal, twisted and scarred, with numbers etched along one edge. It took him a moment to recognize it. A fragment of his own dog tags, the ones that had been damaged during the firefight, the ones he'd assumed were lost forever in the chaos of combat and extraction. How had she known? How had she found them in a valley full of rocks and bullets and death? The answer, Morrison realized, was that Raven saw everything, remembered everything. Understood that a warrior's identity wasn't just about the mission or the unit or the flag. It was about the small things that connected them to home, to family, to the person they were before war changed them. He held the dog tag fragment up to the light, reading his own name etched in metal that had survived firefights and explosions and the impossible physics of rescue. Below his name, barely visible, someone had added something with precise engraving. A small black star. The same star he'd seen on the C-130's engine nacelle. The mark of someone who appeared when death circled closest. Morrison understood then that he'd been marked by something larger than a single rescue mission. He'd been touched by a tradition that stretched back through every war, every conflict, every moment when good soldiers had needed guardian angels to bring them home. He thought about calling Raven, but realized he had no way to reach her. She existed in the spaces between official records, in the classified margins where heroes worked without recognition or reward. But somewhere in the world, a C-130 was flying toward another impossible mission, piloted by a woman who refused to let Americans die alone. The dog tag fragment went into Morrison's wallet, next to photos of his wife and children. A reminder that some promises transcended duty, rank, and regulation. A reminder that ravens remembered everything. And in the darkness of foreign valleys, that memory was often the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. 6 months after the rescue, Morrison found himself in Washington, D.C., attending a classified briefing that he couldn't discuss with anyone, including his wife. The meeting was held in a nondescript government building that could have housed anything from tax auditors to arms dealers. The only indication of its true nature was the security checkpoint that required 3 different forms of identification and a background check that probably reached back to his elementary school attendance records. Colonel Kane was waiting for him in a conference room that looked like every other government meeting space: fluorescent lights, cheap furniture, and the kind of beige walls that suggested someone had given up on making aesthetic choices. But the people in the room were anything but ordinary. "Commander Morrison, thank you for coming." Kane gestured to a chair at the head of a long table. "I'd like you to meet some colleagues." The introductions were sparse: names, ranks, and specializations that painted a picture of America's most elite rescue and recovery specialists. Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Air Force Pararescue, Marine Force Reconnaissance. Warriors who operated in the spaces where conventional military doctrine ended and improvisation began. "Gentlemen, you're here because you've all been recipients of Lazarus Protocol interventions." Kane activated a presentation screen that showed a world map dotted with red markers. "Each of you has been recovered from situations deemed impossible by conventional standards." Morrison studied the faces around the table, recognizing something in their expressions that he'd seen in his own mirror: the look of men who'd been pulled back from the edge by someone willing to risk everything. They'd all met their own version of Raven. "The purpose of this briefing is to inform you that Lazarus Protocol is being expanded." Kane clicked to the next slide, showing organizational charts and budget allocations that made Morrison's eyes water. What began as an experimental program 8 years ago has proven its value beyond question. The numbers were staggering: hundreds of successful extractions, millions of dollars in saved training investments, immeasurable preservation of military experience and institutional knowledge. But Morrison knew the real value couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets and budget reports. "Major Vasquez will be assuming command of the expanded program," Kane continued. "She's requested that each of you consider participating in a consulting capacity, helping to train the next generation of Lazarus pilots." Morrison felt something shift in the room. These weren't just rescued soldiers being offered consulting contracts. They were being invited to become part of something larger, something that would ensure other warriors never had to face what they'd faced. "Sir," a Marine Colonel Morrison didn't recognize spoke up, "what would our role be exactly?" Kane smiled for the first time since Morrison had known her. "You'd help us teach pilots how to think like the people they're trying to save. Combat perspective, tactical awareness, understanding of how special operations teams function under extreme stress. You'd be advisors, instructors, and quality control." Morrison thought about that valley in Afghanistan, about the precision of Raven's operation, about how she'd seemed to anticipate every move his team would make. She hadn't just been a skilled pilot, she'd been someone who understood warriors well enough to save them. "When do we start?" he heard himself saying. The training facility was located in Nevada, far from civilian populations and curious satellites. Morrison arrived on a Tuesday morning to find an installation that looked like a cross between Area 51 and the world's most expensive flight school. Hangars full of modified C-130s and helicopters he didn't recognize, simulators that could replicate any terrain on Earth, and classrooms equipped with technology that made NASA look underfunded. Raven was waiting for him on the flight line, wearing a flight suit that bore new insignia, the eagle of a lieutenant colonel and a unit patch that showed a black star rising from flames. The Lazarus Protocol had given her more than expanded authority. It had given her official recognition for work that had previously existed in the shadows. "Commander Morrison, welcome to the afterlife." She extended her hand, and Morrison was struck again by the calm confidence that seemed to radiate from her, ready to teach some pilots how to perform miracles. Morrison looked around the facility, at aircraft being modified for missions that pushed the boundaries of aviation physics, at pilots who'd volunteered for training that would prepare them to fly into the darkest places on Earth. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I know how to teach miracles." Raven's smile was the same one he'd seen in that C-130 cargo bay, equal parts determination and humanity. "You don't teach the miracle, Commander. You teach the preparation that makes the miracle possible." Over the following weeks, Morrison learned that Lazarus Protocol was more than an elite rescue unit. It was a philosophy of warfare that put individual lives above institutional convenience. Every pilot in the program volunteered, knowing they'd be tasked with missions that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. Every aircraft was modified beyond standard specifications, equipped with technology that transformed cargo planes into precision instruments of salvation. But the real transformation was in the pilots themselves. Morrison watched as men and women who'd started as competent aviators became something approaching mythical. They learned to read terrain like a book, to anticipate enemy movements, to calculate extraction possibilities that exist.